If you want to learn how to make Ghibli style textures in Substance Painter, the latest course from the 3D coloring book was made for you. This beginner-friendly course will show you just how easy it is to make drag and drop anime style smart materials that you can use in any project. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to consider getting the course. Now let's get into this week's video.
Hi there, I'm Patrick and I'm a freelance artist from Australia, and in this video I'll be showing you how I went about making this stylized diorama. It's not going to be a tutorial as such, but I'm going to do my best to break the piece down and explain my entire process from start to finish, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. So let's get started. The first step, of course, is actually coming up with an idea of what to make. My approach is to give yourself some guidelines for the overall project, so right off the bat I knew that I wanted to do a small environment piece, targeted for mobile specs and presented in Unity Engine. I wasn't even thinking about what the environment would be at that stage. But with those guidelines in mind, I got to scribbling out a couple ideas, and it was only my second idea when I landed on a tank buried in the ground, and I liked this because it had a mixture of the exterior and then a cutaway to look at the insides of it, so you could put some details in there. You can see how awful and rough my concept is. I certainly wouldn't be handing this over to someone else as concept art to work from, but when it's just for yourself, I think you can afford to be a bit sloppy. I just see it as a kicking off point before you go into 3D and start fleshing out the design properly, which is what I'm going to do next. Okay, so this is what my Maya scene looks like. This is what the latest version would be. We've got the textures applied, but let's pretend that I don't just for now. You'll see that I like to have kind of everything that I'm working on put in the same scene, just moved off to the side, and the final exported geo is going to sit right in the middle here. So an important thing to note with how I made this is, I'll just show you an earlier version, an earlier block out here. So even back then, I'd established where I was going to put my tank in the terrain, and then I pretty much worked on the tank separately up here, making sure that it was aligned to the grid and aligned to the y-axis, so I could use symmetry where it needed it, even though it wasn't completely symmetrical. So you can see how simple this block out really was. The terrain, basically just a cylinder with a bite taken out of it. For lack of a better word, this tub was it did change shape, but more or less the idea was there. Earlier on, you can see I was thinking about putting a cactus in, but I changed my mind and went with a kind of bushy bit of foliage anyway. So basically, you're just working on the design as you go along, moving things around until you find that right balance. Anyway, back to looking at my final model. I'll talk about how I went from the block out to this version, what became the final. So basically, you could tell from my concept that I had very few details of what I actually was going to do and how this was going to look. But while I'm modeling, I think an important thing is to just bring up as much reference of what you're making as you can. Just think about, at least on a basic level, how this thing is going to function and how it will be interacted with. So I'd put a little bit of thought into that. I know it's definitely not realistic, but if you just put a little bit of thought into how someone might use this thing, I think it really helps ground the design and makes it more believable. So that was modeling the tank, but when it came to modeling the terrain, I decided I'd do a bit of a different process, and I would actually sculpt the terrain in ZBrush and retopologize that, because I just found I would get much better, more organic results, and you get the added benefit that you can then take that sculpt and bake maps from it to use as a base texture. So I'm going to jump into ZBrush and I'll just show you real quick what I had for that. So this is what my ZBrush scene for the terrain looks like. So basically I just imported this I'd imported this very early, just rough shape of the terrain um, with this block out of the tank. So the tank was at this stage, so I knew this was where it was going to sit, and that was pretty much the final position. Can't move it now that I'm sculpting a few details of the terrain around it. So here we have what that high poly sculpt looks like. It's pretty simple, really. I'm just using basic default like damp standard and polish brushes to get this. So decimated the mesh to use as a reference for retopologizing to make a low poly. So I brought the reference mesh from ZBrush into Maya, and then using the quad draw tool, I retopologized by hand to get this low poly. So I guess you could use Z-Remesher and ZBrush or something like that to generate a lower poly version. But I find that you might not get the results you want, and doing it by hand means that you can put all the detail exactly where it needs to be. So that's what I did, and it really didn't take too long. So I'll just show you. If you don't know what the quad draw tool is, you hit it, your reference mesh, and then you click this magnet to make it go live. And then in the modeling toolkit, you've got this quad draw tool, and it lets you place points on top of the reference mesh. So you will then just be able to put points and extrude, and everything will snap to the reference mesh. Honestly, it doesn't take that long. And in my opinion, you're going to get much more of an organic result than if you were just modeling it by hand and completely from scratch. Right, so once we've finished our terrain mesh, it's going to be put into the scene, and the tank is going to be positioned into the terrain. And it's time for a little bit of cleanup, where I will go through and I'll look at all these bits, all the faces of the tank that are going to be just completely hidden by the terrain that aren't going to be seen, so you might as well delete them, especially if you're going to be making something for mobile specs. You've got to be thinking about how you can make it more efficient, and just don't waste any polys. I mean, I could have taken some more out even, but yeah, just think about that kind of thing. So even if no one's ever going to see that stuff, it's a good habit to get into if you ever want to be working on games. I'll just touch on the UVs briefly. It's not a heap to talk about. Basically decided I wanted to split things up and give a separate texture to the tank, the terrain, this tub, the flag, and the foliage. So you could combine some things, but I find that it's just easier to work on if you split things up in that way. And I'll show you what my UVs for the tank look like. So here we go. They're pretty neat and tightly packed. So this is all done by hand. Not a lot to say, except just try and make edges straight, keep things nice and rectangular. That's going to make it a lot easier to pack. For the love of God, do not use an auto map, please. Or if you're just going to pelt map something and then leave it as is. I think people tend to skimp on UVs and don't put that much effort into them because they just don't think people need to see them. Don't be those people. Make some good UVs. Don't be grotty. Make UVs that you want to show off. So there's a few areas where I've been mirroring UVs or stacking shells, which is a good little trick if you want to save some space. My thoughts on that are basically, if you can get away with it, absolutely do it, because the tighter packed your UVs are, the more pixels you're going to get out of your texture. Again, if you're doing anything for games, especially mobile, every pixel counts, and the lower texture res you can get away with, the better. I'll show you what I did for the foliage last, because that was pretty much the last step in my process here. We'll move on to texturing next, and I'll show you how I got these textures. So we're using 3D Coat and Photoshop in my case. Right, I'm going to show you how I set up my terrain texture. So I've taken my high poly sculpt and I've taken my low poly retopo and I have baked them. I've used Gnarled in this case, but you could use any baking program. And I'll show you what maps I've got. So this is a world space, no, this is an object space normal. This is an AO. This is a concavity. And this is a convexity. And we are going to combine these in a way that we can use as a base for our diffuse texture. I will show you how I do that. So with the object space normal, we'll go to the green channel. Now the green channel should give you lighting information as if it's lit from top down, which is generally what you go for with hand-painted textures, is to try and get top-down lighting. So just copy that green channel. Let's go back to this. So we've got this green channel extracted. Now, this is going to be set to a multiply. I feel like that's the go-to when it comes to grayscale maps. Let's just go Shift F5 and fill the base layer with 50% gray. And now I've got this AO map, and guess what? That can also be a multiply. And we've got this concavity. Guess what? That could also be a multiply. I'm going to just fiddle with the strengths of these in a bit. And for the convexity, I like to put it on color dodge. So this is a bit extreme, but of course just keep in mind we're painting over all of this, so it doesn't have to be perfect the first time around. I've just dialed down the strength of the normal map and the AO to get something like this. So you've got a few weird areas, some artifacts from the bake, but that's fine. We're going to be painting over it. And I find the easiest thing to do when you've got this just grayscale map like this and you want to add color is just put a new layer over everything, hard light as the blend mode. Let's just get that kind of, whoa, okay. So that could be the sand color, I guess, and then if we want something darker, and for the rocks. So you get the idea. I work in a hard light layer over the grayscale to add some color. So the next step would be I send this texture into 3D Coat to use as a base when I've got all the other models in the same scene, and we're just texturing everything all together. Okay, so we're in 3D Coat now, and this is kind of my go-to program for doing hand-painted textures. I find that it's got a much nicer feel when you're painting, kind of similar to Photoshop. And also it's got some really nice features, like being linked to Photoshop, so you can send stuff really quickly. So we've imported our model from Maya, but I'll just mention that you should spend a little time setting up your model to be imported into 3D Coat, because you're going to save yourself some effort in the long run. So what I've done is I have split up my model into different pieces. So then when I import them into 3D Coat, you can lock off different areas, which is going to make things a lot easier when you're painting on them. And it's kind of like masking it out. Another thing I did was I applied materials to the different meshes that I want to share textures. So I've got a material for the tank, I've got a material for the terrain, and I've got a material for the tub. So you're going to need to set things up like that if you'll be painting multiple textures in the same scene. So when we've just got this blank grey texture to start with, my first step is going to be probably very similar to a lot of people that paint in 3D Coat, which is to go into your textures menu and then go calculate occlusion, set it to hemisphere for the light sources because you don't want light from coming underneath. New layer. You don't want anti-aliasing, and I think the default is something crazy like 4096 for the light count. I've used 1024. It's going to look ugly, but it's just going to be used as a start. Okay, yep, here we go. So it's certainly not perfect. Hit 2 to go into the unlit mode, which is what I tend to paint in. And unlock the new ambient occlusion layer and turn opacity down to about 75%. Probably good. Sure. So you can see it has not liked some of my stacked UVs, so it's got errors, but we're going to be painting out anything dodgy anyway. So what I'll do to quickly lay some color down, we hit Control P to send one of our UV sets straight to Photoshop so we can edit the textures there. Right, here we are, Photoshop. This is the tanks set. It's the AO baked. We're just going to choose kind of greenish color. We're going to work in a hard light again on top of the AO and just fill it like that. And if we hit Control S, we'll go back to 3D coat and bam, it brings it all in. I'm going to do this for the other chunks as well. So that Control P shortcut is very useful. If you want to quickly make a tweak in Photoshop, you might want to use some special brushes that you've got only in Photoshop, or you might want to use it to be tweaking colors. I use it a ton for all sorts of different things. So once we've got the colors just kind of blocked in, you can use 3D Coat's actual paint tool to fill in the different meshes that I've kept separate. So say we want to make that seat red, we can go just fill it in like that. So it shouldn't take long for you to put in your base colors. And then when it comes to actually painting, I'd make a new layer. And we're going to just be using the default hard round brush. I don't know why the depth is set so high. Smoothing to 100%, opacity to 85 or somewhere around that. And I'll be using that to, say, paint out my errors. Use the V hotkey to sample colors from the texture. So another great trick is if you want to blend, so if you put down some paint and you want to blend it, you hold down Shift and you brush over it, and it kind of blurs the edges. So you can use that to really quickly blend different colors. So one thing I will say that I might do a little bit different to other people is I like to not let my layers get out of hand. So I know being non-destructive definitely has its pluses if you want to go back and tweak some stuff, but I also find that having hundreds of layers all with their own little changes is really going to bog me down. So I try to just make some changes. Say if I want to do some scratches on this layer or something, and then I'll merge it down. And that's pretty much my process for painting, is that I'll just work in a new layer above, and then when I'm happy with that, I'll merge it down. Also, when you're texturing, it's important to think about the final presentation. So in my case, the big thing with hand painting textures is your lighting. So whether you're painting lighting details in or not, we're going to jump over to my final so I can show you my final texture. So you can see that I didn't paint in any cast shadows or anything. I have painted in subtle lighting details, but I haven't painted in anything super strongly because I knew that I was going to be putting it into Unity and lighting it anyway. So it pays to think about that sort of thing. So you can see that even for my final, I used very few layers. I kept my carefully painted decal on the tank in a separate layer, and I only had one layer that used a different blend mode for the area that was sunken in the dirt. One thing I forgot to say earlier was that I am painting these at 2048 by 2048 resolution. So after I exported them, I scaled them down to a more appropriate size in the presentation. It's always nice to work at a little bit bigger texture size than what your final is going to be. You always have that option of up-resing later if you need to. Right, so one of the last things I did for my model was making this foliage, these bushes, and I will show you why. So I actually start with a texture. So what I do is just make a new Photoshop document, and you're going to be just painting the foliage itself. 3 branches of different size should give you enough variation. So painting the branches with transparency, and just make sure you leave enough room around them. The next step is going to be cutting them out, applying them to a plane and cutting them out in Maya, like so. So we have, this is just a plane, just a default plane in Maya. And we have applied the texture. It's got transparency, so you can easily see where things are going to end. And what I like to do is just go to the multi-cut tool and start tracing around an individual bit of the plant till you have something like this. Which is pretty much exactly what I have here. So this is what I do for pretty much all these little bits of foliage. They start with a plane, I cut them out, give them just enough geo edges that you can shape them where they need to be shaped, and I'll show you. This is where I start. I know the wireframe is just nonsense to look at, but you basically are now just using your artistry to start bashing them together, posing them, moving things around. So once you kind of push things all together, you might decide it needs some more edge loops, so you might want to just combine it and do some more cuts across it. And once you've got one of these bushes, then you can cluster them together to make something even bigger, like this. Just jam them all together. And the reason that I started with wanting to do a cactus for this scene and then changed my mind to this kind of thorny bush was that I actually wanted to add some motion to it and get some kind of effect where it's just kind of waving around in the wind. Once I bring that into Unity, I'll be showing you how we can just easily add a few more touches just to give it that little bit of pizzazz. Okay, so modeling is done and texturing is done, which means it's time for the presentation, which is arguably the most important step. So here we are in Unity, and I'm not going to be able to teach you everything about it, but I will be able to tell you some of the important things I did here in the scene. One of the very first things I did, under project settings and player, change the color space from gamma to linear. Don't know if a lot of people know that one, but by default it's gamma color space, which I'm not a fan of, especially for stylized stuff, because once you light it, it can really wash the colors out. So changing it to linear is just an easy way to keep your colors looking vibrant. As for my materials, they're all very simple, just using the mobile diffuse shader, which is one of Unity's legacy ones, so definitely mobile friendly. And another thing Unity likes to do is apply disgusting compression to your textures by default. So what I do is I think it's normally DXT1 or DXT5 by default, which both look really gross up close. So I'm using BC7, but for the purpose of a presentation, I mean, you could have it completely uncompressed. And if you're making a new scene, you'll start with the default Unity skybox, which is not ideal, especially if you're doing a stylized environment like this. Don't use the default skybox. It's very easy to make your own custom skybox, so mine is literally just a gradient. I'll just show you. It's this 128 by 128 gradient, which you change the texture shape to a cube, and then in your lighting settings you can set that as your skybox. Easy. So yes, don't use the default skybox. Not only is it going to look out of place, but people are going to see it and know that that's the default skybox. Making your own gradient like I did is going to take a whole 2 seconds, or if you're feeling adventurous, you could even try painting your own. And I'll walk you through the lighting in my scene. So I'm not going to be able to show it in action because I've actually used baked lighting, which you probably would find in mobile games, as opposed to real time, which is why the flag and the bush aren't casting shadows. Anyway, the light setup is also very simple. This would be the key light. It's just a directional light. It's the only light in the scene that's casting shadows. We have one very large point light, and the purpose of that was both to lighten the cast shadows and to create some nice variation in the lighting where it gets brighter at the center, which you can sort of see. And the final light is a little bluish light in the interior. And I put that there because this is one of the key areas of the environment, and if you've got an area that you want to show off, you should chuck a light in it. So I'll tell you now that I'm getting stuck into the presentation that I'm up to maybe the most important lesson of this video, which is you should be thinking about what the bare minimum is and how you can go just 1 or 2 steps further than that to make it really stand out. So I think in my case, the bare minimum for an environment diorama would be chuck it into an engine and show it off from a few different angles, maybe do a turntable. But I thought about what else I could be doing, and I wanted to breathe some life into it by adding a little bit of motion and hopefully getting a video to show as well. That's why I have just 2 simple elements that help bring it to life compared to just a dead static scene. So we've got the bush, which is kind of looks like it's blowing in the breeze a little bit, and we've got the flag, which is flapping around in the wind too. And they were both very easy to do, and I'll show you real quick how I did them. So the flag is its own prefab. Let me just turn. I'll just stop it from playing to show you what it looks like. It is simply a subdivided plane, and it's got Unity has its own cloth physics, its own cloth component that you can add to something. So this wasn't something I knew how to do before I did this project, but it's very easy to do, and now I know how to do it. I won't explain the whole thing, there's plenty of tutorials out there. You basically just attach this component, and then, much like you would paint weights for skinning, you paint some weights on the vertices, and the rest is kind of just fiddling with settings. It has a random acceleration value, which is what I used to get that random wind flapping look. But it really wasn't that much time to learn how to do this, and I think it looks really good. Now, with the foliage, I mean, theoretically, you could use cloth physics for that as well, but it would be very unnecessary, since all we want is it to just wiggle a little bit. And although I don't write shaders, there are plenty of people that do, and plenty of people that have put that code out on the internet, which is very nice of them. So I just went and I grabbed some code that I found on the Unity forums. I could put that in the description of the video if anybody's interested. But all in all, again, that was extremely simple. Doesn't require any animation, it's just playing with some settings until you find something that you like. And it's also something that's nice and efficient and game friendly. So once the scene has been completely set up, then it's time to just put some cameras in for your final shots that you're going to be showing off. So there's not really anything special to do with the static cameras, just pick some angles that you like, but I wanted to do a turntable as well. That was the only slightly complex thing I did here. And I'll just explain really quick how you can set that up. So make a camera with an angle that you like, and then you create a new empty game object, which is going to kind of function as a group, and you're going to make sure that it's all zeroed out and there's no transforms on it. And you're going to parent that camera to the new object. And I can't really go into animating in Unity because that's a big topic, but there's plenty of info out there. Essentially what you're going to be doing is creating an animation on this turntable group that just rotates the whole thing in Y 360 degrees. So you could approach a turntable by making the actual assets themselves all spin in a group, as opposed to spinning the camera, but I made the camera turn because I have the cloth physics on the flag, and the motion was going to interfere with the cloth physics. Also, it seemed easier. Anyway, there wasn't anything terribly technical I did with my Unity scene, but at the end of it all, you come out with a video of the turntable, and you've got some nice motion from the foliage and the cloth physics, and it really wasn't that hard to set up. Righto. So that's basically my entire process in making this diorama piece from the initial idea to this final in-engine presentation. I know I couldn't show you everything, but I hope at least you've managed to learn a few different things along the way. The main point that I want to impart is that if you're making a portfolio piece, you should be thinking about what that extra step is that you could take to make things stand out. Use the opportunity to learn something new that you've wanted to. Well, thanks for watching. I wish I had something better to plug here, but if you like my work and you want to see more, I can be found at these places, and I very occasionally make new stuff. Cheers!